Hi everyone, this is Ms. Romani, and in this lesson, we will be learning about carbohydrates. Now, you've probably already heard about carbohydrates, or carbs as they are more often called in everyday life. Maybe you've been talking to someone and they mentioned that they no longer eat carbs. So, then what are these carbs? Basically, carbohydrates are sugars, which, yeah, let's avoid these ones as much as possible. But because of these types of sugars, called the simple sugars, which are the leading cause of obesity, diabetes, and most likely also heart disease in Canada and throughout the world. The word carbohydrates and carbs in general are often maligned in many trendy diets. But carbohydrates are actually pretty important to a healthy diet because they are also the starches and fibers found in fruits, grains, vegetables, and milk products. These fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, all of which are carbs, provide our bodies with most of the vitamins and minerals and all of the dietary fiber that keep our bodies healthy and help us fight disease and even help us look good. So, nutritionally, carbs are an interesting and complicated topic. Chemically, carbohydrates are pretty simple. They are organic molecules, meaning that they have a hydrocarbon backbone. But other than carbons and hydrogens, the only other element in their structure is oxygen. These three elements are mostly, though not always, found in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, with one carbon and two hydrogen for every one oxygen. This hydrocarbon right here is glucose. And glucose, like many similar sugars, have the molecular formula C6H12O6 with that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio I just mentioned. Now, this other sugar here is ribose, and its molecular formula is C5H10O5, another 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Now, I mentioned that carbohydrates are important in our diet because of the vitamins, minerals, and fiber that carbohydrate rich food usually contain. But the sugar molecules themselves have a very specific function. In animal cells, carbohydrates provide us with immediate energy and the ability to store energy for the short term. At least in humans, carbohydrates cannot be stored in our body cells for more than a day at most, typically. In plants, carbohydrates provide immediate energy and long term energy storage. They also make up the cell walls of plants and the cell walls of fungi. They provide structural support as well as the exoskeleton of arthropods, so like spiders, lobsters, insects. Carbohydrates also have a function on our cell membranes. Mostly they stick out towards the outside of the cell, where they can help cells stick to each other or to other surfaces and provide specific recognition sites as well. So, obviously, with such a variety of functions, there must also be a variety of carbohydrate structures. And there are. So, let's talk about that. Carbohydrates are broadly classified into two subgroups: simple and complex carbohydrates. The simple carbohydrates include two groups. The first is the monosaccharides, which consist of one sugar molecule. The name implies that because the prefix mono means one and saccharides means sugar in Latin. Now, monosaccharides include sugars like glucose, galactose, and fructose. The other simple carbohydrate are the disaccharides, which consist of two sugar molecules bonded together, since di means two. Examples of disaccharides include maltose, lactose, and sucrose. The complex carbohydrates include two groups as well. One of them is the oligosaccharides. The prefix oligo means a few in Greek, which makes sense because oligosaccharides are made up of 3 to up to 10 sugar molecules bonded together and no more than that. And we won't really get into this group of carbohydrates for this course in this lesson, but a common example you may have heard about is a group of sugars called fructans, which are generally believed to be pretty healthy, but tend to give some people, especially those who suffer from IBS, some digestive issues. And finally, there is the polysaccharides, which are made up of more than 10 sugars bonded together because poly means many. The polysaccharides include starches, glycogen, cellulose, and chitin. Okay, so let's say we bond two monosaccharides together. How about two glucose molecules, for example? First of all, the chemical reaction responsible would be a dehydration synthesis reaction, sometimes called condensation reactions. And in the previous lesson, you learned that these reactions form bonds by removing water, and that functional groups will be involved in the reaction. When the water is removed, a bond is formed then. And now we have a disaccharide, a sugar molecule made up of two sugar monomers bonded together. So let's take a look at how the three monosaccharides we learned about can combine to form the three most common disaccharides. For example, plants make a disaccharide called sucrose by combining glucose and fructose. The sucrose made by plants circulates in the sap, and we can actually isolate it from certain plants to make table sugar. Animals make lactose by bonding galactose and glucose. Lactose is the sugar found in milk, and it's what gives milk its sweet taste. Two glucose together make maltose. When starch is digested by the enzyme amylase, that's the enzyme that is found in our saliva, maltose is produced. Maltose is also found in breads and cereals, and it's an ingredient that is used when making beer. Polysaccharides are also built by dehydration synthesis reaction and broken apart using hydrolysis reactions. There are three main types we will focus on in this course: starches, glycogen, and cellulose. All three are long chains of glucose. There's also a fourth polysaccharide, chitin. All of these polysaccharides have different functions. Starch and glycogen are both storage polysaccharides. Starch stores glucose in plants, and glycogen stores glucose in animal cells. Cellulose and chitin are structural polysaccharides, making up both the cell walls of plant cells and the exoskeleton of some animals. So let's take a closer look. Potatoes are full of starch, long chains of linked glucose molecules that are a storage form of fuel for plants. It is how plants store any extra glucose for the future. You see, plants will make glucose through photosynthesis, and then will use some of that glucose right away for their energy needs. But any extra is linked together to be used for the future and is stored in their cells in different parts of the plant as starch. For example, in this potato, that's a perfect example of a place where a plant might store a lot of that extra starch. Plants also store a lot of their starch in their seeds, and this is so that the starch can serve as food for their embryo. Most of our grain crops, like wheat, rice, or corn, are seeds, and they are great sources of starch. So, starch molecules are formed in plant cells so that plant cells can access extra glucose molecules whenever they need energy. But what about animal cells? Can we store glucose that way? And the answer is yes, but not using starch. We use a similar molecule called glycogen. Like starch, glycogen is a polymer of glucose, but unlike starch, it can't store glucose for a long time. For humans, our ability to store glycogen is limited. We store it in our liver and in our muscle cells, but the amount we can store will last us about 1 to 2 hours of intense exercise, or maybe up to 12 to 24 hours of just regular activities. When we eat carbs, say like a potato that is full of starch, we break it down in our digestive system. Enzymes in our small intestine will use hydrolysis reactions to break the starch down into glucose. The glucose then travels to our cells in our bloodstream, enters our cells, and provides our cells with energy. Now, when we digested that potato, though, we absorbed way more glucose than our bodies needed for immediate energy. Some of that glucose was used for energy right away, but a lot of the extra glucose moves into our muscle and our liver cells to be stored for later. In our liver and our muscle cells, we can form bonds between glucose molecules, making a large molecule called glycogen. And just like a car has a gas tank that can store gasoline, our liver and muscle cells can serve as glucose gas tanks, storing glucose as glycogen for when we need more fuel. And so then when our blood sugar is low and we need more sugar for energy, the bonds in glycogen are broken and glucose is released into our bloodstream or directly into our muscle cells. So, as you may gather, our ability to store glycogen for later is pretty important. It keeps us from having to consume sugar 24/7 so that we can keep our blood sugar levels even between meals. And for athletes, glycogen provides much needed sugar energy during, say, a race. During a race, their bodies burn through the glucose in their blood very quickly, so they have to rely on their glycogen stores for energy. When their glycogen stores become depleted, their bodies can, of course, turn to fat as a source of energy. But although fat can store a lot of energy, getting the energy from fat is way less efficient than getting the energy from sugars. And as a result, when glycogen stores are empty, athletes sometimes feel a drop in energy during the race, sometimes referred to as hitting the wall. So let's move on to the third polysaccharide, cellulose. Unlike starch and glycogen, which are storage polysaccharides and are used to store extra glucose for plants and animals, cellulose is a structural polysaccharide. Its role is to make up the strong cell walls of plant cells. And just like the other polysaccharides, cellulose is made up of long glucose chains. However, it uses a slightly different version of glucose, one that humans can't digest. Now, some animals can actually digest cellulose, in particular the herbivores like, say, cows and sheep. But we can't. We just don't have the enzymes to break the bonds between the glucose molecules in cellulose. So, what's interesting about cellulose is that despite the fact that we can't digest it, meaning that it basically goes in one end and out the other without being absorbed into our bloodstream at all, a diet that is high in cellulose is extremely important for optimal health. Now, cellulose is usually just called fiber, and that's probably how you've heard it referred to before. And diets that are high in fiber, like for example whole grains and fruits and vegetables and seeds, have many different health benefits. It plays a vital role in slowing down our sugar absorption and reducing our risk of diabetes and heart disease, and also some cancers. It also helps to keep us regular and to keep us feeling full when we eat. Now, some herbivores like cows and sheep and buffaloes and horses and koala bears have specialized microbes in their guts that actually help them digest cellulose. So they themselves don't produce the enzymes to digest cellulose either, but they do have this symbiotic relationship with a special um, microbe or organisms that live within them that will digest cellulose and then will release the glucose in cellulose, and then they'll be able to utilize that glucose. Wood chewing termites also break down cellulose because they have these microorganisms in their guts. Speaking of termites, insects and all other arthropods make a polysaccharide called chitin to form their exoskeleton. An exoskeleton is a hard external skeleton which protects their soft inner body parts. And if you've ever stepped on an insect and heard a crunch, you know that chitin is pretty strong. So, chitin is a sugar. Fungi also produce chitin. While the cell walls of plant cells are made out of cellulose, the cell walls of fungi are actually made out of chitin. So, chitin is a very strong sugar, and its structure kind of resembles cellulose. So, to summarize, the four main polysaccharides are starch, glycogen, cellulose, and chitin. Starch and glycogen are both storage polysaccharides that are used by plants and animals, respectively, to store glucose. Cellulose and chitin are both strong structural polysaccharides and are both made out of glucose chains. And that's it for this lesson on carbohydrates. So, I will talk to you later, guys.